So welcome back, everyone. We're going to start getting started. I know some people are still wandering in, but we'll just open. Ed was tickling me. So we're going to just begin with a little grounding and open with a simple chant that we used during the dialogue process yesterday. The words are simply "Open my heart." And we closed worship with that beautiful heart opening song. And so we're going to open this panel with another heart opening. There are two lines to this. So the first one goes like this. Open my heart, open my heart. So try that with me. Open my heart, open my heart. Beautiful. The second is a little more complex. It's open my heart, open my heart. So maybe listen one more time to that. Open my heart, open my heart. One more time. Open my heart, open my heart. Beautiful. So we'll start with that first bass line, and if anyone wants to weave that second one in, just weave it in as you feel moved to. But first, just take a deep breath together. And allow awareness to drop from your mental center, if it happens to be hanging out there, and to expand down into your heart, into your spacious heart center, and into your breath and your body. And then join in as you feel moved. Open my heart, open my heart, open my heart, open my heart, open my heart. Open my heart, 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 open my heart. So that's the work we're up to, opening our hearts, opening the heart of the world. And we're going to have a panel with some folks who worked with Father Thomas over the years, who were mentored and shaped and befriended by him. And what we're going to be discussing, what they're going to be leading us in, is a conversation about the future of interspirituality. Where's this interspiritual current, this curve, headed? And what's our work in that movement? And for those of you who might have not been here yesterday, just to give you a little background on that word itself, it's a relatively new word in the English lexicon. A Roman Catholic lay monk, Brother Wayne Teasdale, coined the word interspirituality in 1999. So it's a 20-year-old word. And he intended it as pointing to a different level or degree of dialogue across our sacred traditions than had usually been signified by the word interfaith. So interfaith was the conversation, the dialogue of goodwill between the different traditions that Wayne said usually happened at the intellectual or the social level. So you get together for an interfaith dinner, and you build a Habitat for Humanity house together with the local synagogue and the local Zen Buddhist temple. You get to know each other. And he said the interfaith questions tended to center around, what do you believe? You tell me what you believe, I'll tell you what I believe. And Wayne said that interspirituality was a dialogue that happened at the contemplative level. And so the question shifted from what do you believe to how do you pray? How do you practice? How do you experience the holy? And then it evidenced a willingness to experience, touch, taste the holy in your neighbor's tradition. And so it was a very vulnerable kind of dialogue where you didn't just talk at the head level, but you opened yourself at the heart level and encountered that other tradition. And so he said it wasn't a synthesis of all the existing religions or a new religion. He said it was a willingness to touch and taste the mystical depth of another tradition across the old lines and boundaries. And it was a willingness to share the interior spiritual resources of the traditions across the old lines and boundaries. And so Father Thomas picked up that word. He had been doing that work with the Snowmass Conference, and he really gave manifestation through his dialogue process and through the Spiritual Paths Institute Foundation for Wayne's vision. And so we're going to invite some folks up who have been a part of that work and hear from them. So all of you who are on this panel, it's Kurt and Gabrielle and Rory and Ed. Come on up and take your seats. Gabrielle or Bree Stoner here. Bree is sometimes referred to as a mom, mystic, and musician. She works for the Richard Rohr Center for Action and Contemplation, and she's been a student of Cynthia Bourgeault for several years now. And she's really inspired by Teilhard de Chardin's vision of an evolutionary mysticism. And she's done a lot of work on how we bring mindfulness into parenting, for example, how we infuse this into daily life in the world beyond the meditation cushion. Rory Mcentee here. Rory is an old friend of Father Thomas, and he's the co-author with Adam Bucko of The New Monasticism, which is an interspiritual manifesto. And Rory really has been handed the torch of continuing the Snowmass interspiritual dialogue process. He was mentored in that process, and along with Nathaniel and Adam Bucko, Nathaniel Miles Ypez and Adam Bucko, they've been holding dialogues in different places. Mepkin Abbey in South Carolina, the Abode in New York, all across the country, they've been furthering that dialogue process. Kurt Johnson is an old friend of Wayne Teasdale's and of Father Tom's, and he wrote a really important book called The Coming Interspiritual Age, and has really synthesized an overview of what's happening from an evolutionary and spiritual perspective. And he's something of an unofficial ringleader within the interspiritual movement. And Ed Bastian, as many of you know, one of the founders of the Spiritual Paths Institute or Foundation. Which is it now, Ed? It's changed names a couple times.
It's a foundation, but within it there's an institute.
Okay, so, Ed has been developing a process of interspiritual meditation and a tool to help individuals assess their own spiritual temperament and the kind of paths they might be drawn to or that might most fit who they are. And he'll talk a little bit about that and the idea of contemplative education and interspiritual education. So you've got microphones to pass around. So I want to just jump in, and maybe Rory could start with talking a little bit about the interspiritual dialogue process, which is really the movement that births so much of what's brought us together and that he's helping carry on now, and how you see that engaging where we're going.
Sure. Thank you for the beautiful introduction, and thank you, Aspen Chapel, for having us and for everyone here. I guess when I think about the dialogue process, so I was with Father Thomas last maybe 5 years of the Snowmass dialogues, and then when they came to an end, we've continued them on. I think about a few different things. So I was thinking of it's been talked about a few times. Ed talked about kind of this idea of interspirituality. These traditions are dropping pebbles in a pond, and then they're spreading out and kind of interacting. And what I'm thinking about is, something like that has always been happening. Our traditions were never separate, right? They're always always already infected by other traditions, because we're human beings and we interact with each other. They're not these sort of castles in the sky that nobody gets access to. So I think that's always been happening. And when something's going on in Tibet, it's a breakthrough in the mind or the heart, that spreads, and other traditions feel it, get infected by it. We're connected on many different levels. And I say that as a precursor because we're also very connected on a very bodily level. And there's something about the embodied process of being together. Our flesh, our bones, our marrow have their own way of interacting and their own kind of unity. And so something like what Thomas did with the Snowmass dialogues was bringing advanced practitioners and teachers from the traditions together in embodied form, and then really just seeing what would happen. He was a convener. And so something special happens there, and we're continuing that process along. And maybe I'll just leave it at that. I'll maybe say a little more later, and we'll try and do little shorter things, so we have a little more of a conversation.
So part of what I hear you talking about is this sort of mutational process that's going on, that when Snowmass, when the interspiritual dialogues began, Ed talked about these people who represented sort of supposedly pristine traditions, self-contained traditions, and they started becoming permeable to each other and overlapping in their heart space and in their consciousness. And increasingly now we see traditions not overlapping between people, but overlapping within people, and people who are planted in multiple streams. And I know, Bree, you've written beautifully about what you've called a global interspiritual Pentecost, using Christian language, and that you yourself have recently visited a Zen center and you were moved by that. And I wonder if you might talk a little bit about the sort of mutational process that we see happening.
We're mutants. We were joking as we were thinking about this as like X-Men, like we're like the next, you guys don't know what X-Men is.
Yay!
I see like 3 head nods. Oh dear. Anyway. So I like to think, because I am such a student of Teilhard, I like to think about this in terms of the framework of evolution. And in his framework, evolution wasn't just kind of wandering around on this adventure of like whatever. Evolution was purposeful. It's weaving itself together. It's moving toward wholeness and complexification and centration, which means that it's not just kind of randomly shooting outward, but seeking more unity and more strands of unity. We can think about this as a great braid that's being braided over, the span of life on this planet. And so I think one of the things that's exciting about the future of this inner spiritual movement is that weaving. I feel a sense of, it is really beautiful that that Wayne Teasdale said, I'm not trying to start a new religion. This isn't about starting a new religion. This is about just learning how to be deeply conversant in more than one tradition. And I might take it one step further and say, maybe we do need to create a universal beginning point for people, a place to begin, so that they can have greater access to the wisdom and depth of all of these traditions. And that will require us to view kind of a pathway of formation where there's a big, great, wide gate, and that big, great, wide gate might have a practical, universal entry point for people who maybe don't identify as religious, but rather spiritual, or who have been burned by particular institutions. And I think this kind of way of expanding our conversation and way of expanding our starting points is something that's very much on my heart. And part of what I think is a Teilhardian vision of the movement of the Spirit, an opportunity, a Pentecostal opportunity for us to speak in many tongues together.
Beautiful. So that makes me actually want to jump straight to Ed, because you're talking about a universal beginning point for people to enter. And with Ed's interspiritual meditation practice and Mandala, which he can tell us more about, you've laid a beginning foundation, but it's also an access point into the traditions. And so someone might find through that access point that they're drawn to Buddhism, and you will help them find the resources, or to Sufism. And so, Ed.
Yeah, excuse me. I started on this when I was working at the Smithsonian in the 1980s. And I was directing the first biodiversity programs there. When the program National Forum, we invented the word biodiversity, which seems hard to believe. Before there was the National Academy of Sciences, there was a board on basic biology that Kurt would be familiar with, and E.L. Wilson was chair. And then within that, there was this studies on biological diversity. And I was then the Smithsonian representative in this room. I actually knew nothing about biology, which I learned was kind of an advantage, because I didn't even understand the nuances of the arguments between them. But it was clear to me that there was something being birthed. And what they were saying was that in the case of the Smithsonian, big emphasis on systematics, which Kurt is an expert at, among other things, where people were studying the individuals of each species. And they were going to the Amazon and collecting lots of beetles and bugs and putting them on boards and files and really studying each one and trying to get a taxonomy of all these major species. And then there was the Ecology Movement, correct me if I'm overstating these things, Kurt, and where people began to see all of these individuals within an ecosystem, that there was a mutual interdependency among all these individuals where their individual health depended on an ecosystem within which they resided. Then this biological diversity began to emerge, which is the recognition that diversity is required, a certain level of diversity is required within an ecosystem for every individual of every species to exist. So I naturally, because I had been kind of Buddhist oriented, I love that, because now we're talking about interdependence, we're talking about impermanence, and this really fit for me, this excited me. So my colleague at the National Academy got credit by E.O. Wilson. I'm not sure, I didn't say it first, but anyway, he got credit for coining the term biodiversity. So I have often thought, moving forward, just as biodiversity caught the imagination and it became the name, interspiritual is that name. Now, it's the name.
His mic's dropped out, if someone can.
It's the name, interspirituality then is the kind of the analog to biodiversity. So within this framework now, we have this extraordinary, amazing diversity of spiritual traditions and interpretations and practices, out of which the individual religions were formed. And then you were mentioning, so Kurt, you can start shaking your head this way anytime when I start to blow it.
You're doing great.
So what often happens is that you form like a subspecies or a species gets formed, and it starts to take over territory, right? And it becomes the dominant species, and it begins to lose its vitality, because it's not being influenced by or threatened by others, and so the opportunities within its own genome are not being activated, which can enrich it and can help its survival, right? So now what we've seen, using that biological metaphor, we see this now with religions, that over time we see it with our education system, that was sort of the aftermath of the Industrial Revolution. Why can't people be like cars? Why can't we run people through an assembly line where they get downloaded each little thing for every part and then spit out at the end where they can enter into the society and be productive members of society, right? And we all know this is a huge travesty. It's a desecration of our human right to be individuals, to be diverse, to learn the way in which we learn, to experience the way in which we experience. So I feel like religions have done that, and a lot of people are leaving. They're not working anymore. So what's the antidote? Right? Now the Pew Trust, their polls tell us that's up to 40% of Americans don't have a religious affiliation. Now we're talking 150, 60 million people in this country. That's a big number. They need help, just like human beings from the beginning of time need help. And they have nowhere to turn because the religions that people once relied on for help of who they are essentially, how they connect with a greater being or power or truth, what's the meaning and purpose of their life, what am I going to do with my life, is no longer there for them. So people are, whether you're a millennial or an X-gen or a boomer, we're kind of left adrift. So what are we going to do educationally to help? So therefore, I learned a lot within Buddhism of the power, and Hinduism and others, of the power of a visual mandala as a visual aid in which you could then create a new kind of environment within which people could begin to put together their own spiritual path. So within our work, there are two mandalas. One is called the interspiritual mandala, and it's 7 interwoven steps. And they're like an unbroken knot. So within that, people can start anywhere, but there is a kind of order that would be helpful, and I did it yesterday. These become the baskets within which people can then put meaning and purpose and wisdom that they're gathering from various sources. They have an organized way to do it. So within an educational framework, then they go onto the website, and the websites have a long ways to go, but they can then begin to put together their meditation practice based on great wisdom, and hopefully working with mentors and facilitators to help them to do a responsible job at that, so they're not misappropriating the practices from one tradition onto another, putting together things that don't fit well together. And the other one is, the other mandala has 3 concentric circles, and on the outer ring is our archetypal spiritual styles, as in learning styles, as in Enneagram styles, as in Myers-Briggs styles, but these are 12 that are devoted to spirituality, spiritual learning. Whether your way is nature, or the intellect, or the body, or all the different ways in which you can think of, to give people an opportunity to enter into the creation of their spirituality based on who they are, how they learn, where their natural predispositions are, to begin. The next circle in, and I'll stop, is 12 families of perennial questions. What is God? What is soul? What happens when I die? What's reality? Existence? How did things begin? These are all the classical questions that every human being has had for every generation for as long as there have been human beings, I'm sure. People still need answers, and every generation has to figure it out for themselves individually. In the third circle are 12 families of traditions or sources, some of which are spiritual, some of which are secular. So the opportunity then is to help people using the internet now, which is now where people are going to go, responsibly, so that the internet can become a reliable, responsible source to help people put together their path. But on the internet, when you do a search for mindfulness in Buddhism, you get 17 million results if you go to Google. Oh, 17 million pages. Right? Where are you going to start? How do you know which is good? How do you know which sources to trust? So we've been developing an algorithm to help people find what they want based on their styles, their questions, etc. So similarly, so that's the kind of, not that we're doing now is going to be the answer, but it's an example of an educational form that I feel there will be lots of other examples, I hope, that we can move into to help the future generations as well as our present generation to create meaning, purpose, who we are essentially, how we connect with a grander reality, to join at the heart, like we did at the Snowmass Conference, so we can make peace in this world, so we can get along, we can infuse the political system with these deep values. So to me, that's my little piece, which is the education part.
So that brings up a question for me about community, and if people use these tools and find doorways into practice and a sort of build it yourself spirituality, I wonder, and Kurt, you can jump in with this, how do they then, so the traditions give us community, they give us form, they give us ritual, there's something shared that happens there that in our atomized society and through the internet may be being lost, and I wonder what you think the future of those communities are, how they coalesce, and how that relates to the existing great traditions. So run with it, Kurt, and go wherever you want to go.
Yeah, so I want to hearken us back to what Eric read from Father Keating this morning, where he talked about this confluence of science's way of knowing and spirituality's way of knowing. And it was also in the second clip that Ed played yesterday afternoon, where Father Thomas was talking directly about this. And it comes from the conversation we had yesterday, which was centered on the self and spiritual development and our own personal development toward being creatures of love and vessels of love and mutuality, reciprocity, and all that involves the world that we would like to see. So the question that we need to ask in this confluence of science and spirituality is there a parallel, is there a reflection of that at the grand community level globally and in evolutionary process that's also going that direction, which Bree said was Teilhard's vision? And the answer to that is yes. And I just want to say the background to this is after leaving my years in monasticism and finishing a doctorate in evolution, ecology, comparative biology, and systematics, I was lucky to walk out of the door of Holy Cross Monastery and into a plum job at the American Museum of Natural History in New York, where I was for 30 years. So I was in the thick of this development and seeing this happen. And it was really the argument about the degree of universality and what we'd been told about Darwin's message. We'd been told that Darwin's message was about survival of the fittest, it was about Shark Tank, it's about everything we see in our economics today, our politics and our business, that I win and you lose. And the assumption laid on what Darwin's work was that that was the world we were living in. So if actually we were coming from a spiritual place or a place in the heart, then we were actually swimming upstream against how science was telling us that biological process really worked. Well, this went through a gigantic sea change starting in 2015. And there was a book published by Yale Templeton in 2015, Volume 1 of the Foundational Questions of Science, and it was about this question of natural selection. What does nature want? What does nature want to see? And the emerging paradigm then changed from the comparative paradigm, the competitive paradigm, to the cooperative paradigm. And basically it was this conclusion, and as Ed mentioned, his namesake, Ed Wilson, E.O. Wilson at Harvard, joined David Sloan Wilson at State University of New York, University of Oslo in Norway, in redefining science's paradigm and also all of sociobiology, which is the biology of social organisms, and obviously we're one of those, and saying that it's very simple, that at the primitive levels competition is selected, but as soon as there is any complexity and as soon as there is any conscious choice in a conscious organism like ourselves, nature chooses the best cooperator. So that's called group selection, a multi-level selection, and it absolutely says the game changes with complexity, and what nature chooses is not the competitor, but the cooperator. So to actually jump to something Ken Wilber said, which is, again, very easy to comprehend. If we take complexity and we see that the only way complexity could work is inclusivity, what is that? LOVE, right? It's not a big jump from complexity and inclusivity back to this common word of love, which we're all talking about. So this is a gigantic sea change. The Dalai Lama has invited David to come over and explain all this to him in November. We can't think that overnight, science can change its mind, but can business, politics, and economics change its mind? Those are not easy fulcrum points, in our society that's driven by greed and by ego. But at least the good news is that the decision of science based on the data sets now is that evolution is all about cooperation and inclusivity once there's any complexity.
Thank you, Kurt. So that's
Welcome.
That's hopeful. I want to. Do you have something, Rory? Go ahead, and jump in. Yeah, please respond.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm struck by what everyone said, and in terms of a starting point and the need for cooperation and complexity, and then kind of the thing you brought in with genes, and what I was saying, this embodied element, right? And I think what I want to do is just offer a quick little vision of kind of one thing I'm seeing in the future, right, coming. And the form is less important, other than I think there's something about the zeitgeist of the times and a lot of what I'm seeing and yearning in a younger generation, especially. It's kind of like we've had our traditions, right, hanging out, and they've been affecting each other and doing all this, and, once in a while people were going back and forth between traditions, meeting each other, and this started happening more and more, especially in our country, which is the most religiously and culturally diverse country, and we're really struggling with what that means right now. We don't have a great history with it. And then there's things like the Snowmass Conference that came through and kind of where people started meeting embodied. And so I guess the vision I have is of a starting point for people, something like a monastery or a retreat center, where what you actually have there are fairly advanced practitioners or teachers who are from different traditions, but who are living together in community. And then from that place, offering formation processes to younger people and teachings to a new generation. That captures an embodied element. It captures another level of cooperation from an evolutionary standpoint. And it's not just what they would be offering the students. There's also a lateral formation going on there among the teachers themselves. So it's a model that's not so much, I have my teacher, they let me teach, I teach others, but all of a sudden the teachers themselves from different traditions and places, and some from none at all. I don't happen to claim a particular tradition, doesn't mean I come from nowhere or haven't had my teachers, but those teachers are now watching over each other, right? What do you see with this student? What do you see with this student? How am I doing, right? A lot of the scandals we've had with spiritual teachers are very problematic. This is one way to offer a new model that's circular. I won't say non-hierarchical because there's levels of discernment. But it's another step into exploring what's coming forward here.
Bree, I also want to bring up too, I know you've struggled to find actual community that meets the needs of our spiritual moment. And
Because I'm a single mom and I have 2 kids and
yeah,
I can't
because
get
of that
away to a
too.
monastery.
Because of that too, but also because we live in a sort of evolutionary wonky moment where the old forms often don't fit the emerging consciousness and the new forms don't exist, and
Yeah.
it's hard to find a fit.
Yeah.
And you've talked about visiting churches that just didn't fit. And so how we build community that's rooted and has practice and transformation today.
So I want to talk about a couple of different points with this, because there's an evolutionary component to this that Kurt has brought up, which is you now have for the first time a generation that has grown up with the internet. And that changes how a person thinks of self and other. In other words, all the Pew Research studies show that millennials identify as planetary, not where they are from nationally. They cannot abide exclusivity because they've grown up in a universe where everything is connected. So that's imprinted on the very mind of all of our young people now. This is the starting point. So anything that starts to smell as exclusive or tribal, we're a part of this and these people aren't welcome or allowed, we're right and these people are wrong, isn't going to work. And we see that, right? These institutional models that have carried us faithfully thus far are no longer working. And many of us have felt confused by that, saddened by that, questioning where things are going. If you come from my evangelical background, you hear things like, everything's going to hell in a handbag. And that's not true. But it does require for us to be adaptable and be cooperative with evolution. And one of the things that's happening is that because this middle ground of community, this, you kind of have this big, okay, I'm a millennial, so I identify as planetary, that's great. But the middle circles of community between myself and the planet, those structures that used to be in place are crumbling or have crumbled. So it's very difficult for millennials to find sustained community of support and paths of transformation. Those skills to walk into a new place are atrophied because we don't have the practice that many of you had when you had your Rotary clubs or your Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, and your churches, and you had a lot of training in how to build a sustained community that was supportive for your life. But most of us who are younger do not have that anymore. So what do? We turn to the internet. And so we're like, I'm just going to build this, okay, I'm going to build my identity through the internet. But we all know that the internet has this side of it that is very, I'm going to share myself with you. I'm just going to share the best parts of myself. I'm not going to share all of myself. And I'm protected. I'm protected from this, deep vulnerability wall. But I just want to speak to what you brought up, Rory, because I think it's going to take a movement ecology way of thinking about these things. I think there will be needs for deep communities of physical, monasteries of practice. We absolutely need the depth to be there. But we also need to be making more accessible entry points. Headspace app is one of the most downloaded apps ever. I'm talking about millions of users. And for those of you who don't know what Headspace is, or apps are, do you know what apps are? Just checking, making sure. Just didn't want to make any assumptions. So Headspace is an app that teaches people meditation. And it is one of the most downloaded apps ever. So this technology is being utilized. People are hungry for it. So what does it look like to dream of building community spaces at that level of app building, of accessibility? How can we create an inner spiritual movement of guided pathways, or even provide a universal pathway that's compatible with science and atheism? Why not? I love that Richard Rohr says, you don't need to be a Christian to be a Christian. You don't have to use the word. To be a Christian is someone who can see Christ in everything, and you don't need the label to live that way. So I would like to invite us into a large expansion of our imagination, where we drop the labels and think together creatively. How can we cooperate with this moment in evolution to make this path so accessible that people can have access to it? So practical that the military can start using it. Do you know that the military is adopting mindfulness? Have you heard this? I mean, let's take that to the next level. Mindfulness is now in our schools through social and emotional learning programs. Mind Up is one of those programs that's teaching kids mindfulness. How are we supporting them? How are we in this inner spiritual movement paying attention to all of the different pieces of this great movement that we're a part of in evolution? How are we thinking creatively together about how we're going to face this coming election? How are we going to create prayer circles? I already said, what did I say? Connection caucuses? Connection caucuses. How are we going to hold spaces for the people in our communities who are going to be just brutalized by the divisiveness? How can we bring that level of mindfulness, consciousness, depth to our speech in how we engage on Facebook, which is very polarizing? So I don't know. These are the things that are swirling around and part of this conversation that you're going to keep going.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, it's interesting. I also sit on a number of committees at the UN. And I was sitting here looking at you all, and then there's all these folk in that back gallery, all those pictures in the back. So it's really like being at the UN. But here's the message. There's nobody at those meetings from all those NGOs around the world that are working on any cause, from women to water to ecology, sustainability, that aren't asking exactly this question and in this consciousness. And one of the other committees I'm on is International Day of Yoga Committee. So if you're going around the global yoga communities, then you're in that same conversation, but at the level of very single-pointed, focused spiritual practice. And the bottom line is everyone's asking, how do we get to the heart? They can't maybe put it in those terms because that's not maybe kosher in their environment, but they're asking, how do we get to the world of the heart? And I think this whole discussion revolves around any context, it's that one. I haven't gone anywhere in the world where I didn't ask that question about getting to the world of the heart that people responded. So I think people get that, and they get it strongly.
Sorry to dominate, but men have done that for a while, so I guess it's okay. I think part of what's happening here is that we have created such a hierarchy of transcendence and of practice and of what we mean by spiritual attainment or enlightenment. We have associated this path of transformation with a very singular individual focus. And that's okay. That needs to be there. But I just want to call that out together, if we can just have like a little come to Jesus moment, that we often glorify the cushion more than we glorify the very practical, radical steps of just bringing somebody new along into the path. And I have heard people in the community dismiss Richard Rohr because he's contemplative light, or because, he's so accessible. Oh, that's not deep. That's not real enlightenment. And honestly, we cannot continue to think that way. We have to begin thinking about all of this belongs. Everybody has a very critical post to play, but we can no longer afford our children, my children. I cannot afford to view my meditation cushion as the extent of my practice and path. And we must take seriously this bodhisattva calling to ease the suffering of our planet, and to do so in practical ways, and to not see that as somehow watering down our traditions or not being deeply spiritually committed. Because trust me, if I could be a monk, I would be. And in many ways I am, in the monastery of my own four walls with my 2 kids who call my bullshit out every day. But that kind of thinking, that deep spirituality, that deep inner spiritual commitment and sharing and exploration can only happen in this particular context. That's old thinking. The future is female, and by that I do not mean just women leading. I mean the values of femininity, of inclusivity, of nurturing, of diversification, and of deep support for the practical aspects that make things like this happen. I just want to honor the fact that Heather has pulled so much logistical time and effort and sweat and tears to make a gathering like this take place. But we often don't bow to Heather. We bow to the teachers. And Heather is a teacher. And so I just... So we're all teachers, and we are all being called, and none of us have a less important post to play.
Thank you, Bree.
Thank you for that.
Yeah. So Ed brought up the idea of how we're talking about how we make this practical. How do we make this practical? And one of the words that Bree and I joked about was using Christian language, evangelism, sharing the good news. What does contemplative interspiritual evangelism look like? How do we infuse this? How do we don't just keep it as a treasure that we sit on and feel good about, but infuse it into structures, systems, into politics, And I want to see if Ed has something to say first, because we've not come around
I'm
to
going to
him.
do that,
All right.
but I'm just going to say that the answer that we're seeing around the world is networks of networks. Find your tribe, find your soul group. It's happening because Source directs it. And boy, the synergy that comes from those networks that meet each other, and bingo, the serendipities come forward, inspiration. So God is on our side.
Woo.
I'm not gonna go there.
What does the Buddhist think about that? Yeah.
And I'm a Buddhist. I think going forward, one of the things I've mentioned my pet stuff, which is education, and trying to provide a really dynamic adventure site, like the hero's journey that Campbell dreamt of, but in the internet environment, and make it very compelling, so people would have fun and really want to engage in it. That's one. But I think that and I think everybody here has projects that they're doing. Rory is dedicated to the new monastic idea, and Bree, you're doing incredible things. Kurt is a leader in many, many ways. But I think it's defining what it is that is really unique and what really defines the core of interspirituality. A little more than some pontifications, you know. What are the core ethics of interspirituality? What are the core values that distinguish it? How do we, within the interspiritual growing community, how do we honor diversity and diverse perspectives? How do we engage, and Rory's been doing this and others, is how do we create forms of dialogue and communication that by our way of communicating with each other, by our way of looking at each other, by our body language, by our methodology, and there are examples of this now. You know, Parker Palmer's work comes to mind. And in our spiritual paths, we've come up with, you know, kind of 12 principles for how you engage in an interspiritual kind of dialogue. So I think there's still foundational work to do, but if we work together as a team we now have like 4 generations, sort of, you know, we're talking about Father Thomas, 95, I'm 75. We have folks here that are in their 50s, and then you're early 30s?
40s and 30s. Yeah.
Huh? What are you? You look, well, you look, I know. So anyway, we have represented here like 4 generations of work. So there's a lot of work that we have to do together. You know, it's not as if because we're older we have all the answers, but we have some experience. You know, we've tried stuff. You know, and you're growing up with your generation, the millennials and the X, everything that's coming along that we need to be very sensitive to and think about how we are now going to use the media of communication as a kind of transition point where we can bring the wisdom, classical wisdom that has been with us first as oral traditions, then as, you know, painfully put down on palm leaves, etc., and then through a printing press, and then, you know, through all these modes of communication, and now finally to the internet. And the internet is glomming it all together, and a lot of the great wisdom is sinking like silt to the bottom of the ocean because search engines don't recognize them, right? So we have a big job to do together. And I think that actually, if you think about Thomas in the early 80s, before him, Bede Griffiths, and then Wayne coming up, and now us, 2020, right? We're dealing with, you know, 40, 50, 60 years for this seed to germinate, right? And now it's time for us to nurture it well, craft it, and do it as a team together. And then we can form, you know, along with alliances and help, some of the future of this thing. but we just have to do it together because we cannot splinter off in our own independent directions. We have to do what's passionate to us, but at the same time, we need to make time intentionally to be together, to work together, whether it's Zoom or getting together, or however we do it, because there's a shared wisdom, energy that's absolutely crucial going forward.
Thank you. So I want to, Rory, if you want to jump in, then what I want to do is actually take a little moment to take a breath together. We're coming down to the last 15 minutes and see if there are questions coming from all of you that you would like to pose. And I also want to recognize that we've got some other wonderful elders here, and if you have some, and people who have also been mentored by Thomas, if you have something you'd like to bring in, weave that in. So.
Yeah, I'll just be quick. I want to affirm everything Bree said. And just mention one of the things we talk a lot in terms of new monasticism, kind of being a monk in the world, is this spiritual practice of vocation and asking this question from the very beginning of the path. And what I mean by that is vocation is really asking the question, how am I being called to best serve the world right now? And it's almost like the world as a collective responds, takes in that yearning, and then responds to us as a collective. And that can look like many, many different things. Being a mother. My sister is a mother. It's so clear to me that that's her spiritual path. That's what she's called to right now. I mean, this vocation thing, it's not like one thing, this is what I do. It's a lifestyle. It's a way of living and asking this question. And I see like my sister suffers because it's not as clear to her that this is actually her spiritual vocation at this moment in time very deeply. And when we can embrace that and see that, even if it's something we don't want to be doing, administrative work and other stuff, there's at least a notion like, this is in my path, this is what I'm called to right now. And it's a way of manifesting this non-separation between the world and contemplative life. I'm not going over here and then, getting all this energy and bringing it into the world. It's actually just always there as part of my spiritual life all of the time. Some of us may be in retreat, some of us may be mothers doing this work, that work, but it's all in solidarity. And it's all an integral part of a new monastic path in any case.
Just to respond to that, I think the image that's coming to my mind as you're speaking, Rory, is being bridge builders or being bridges ourselves. So one thing that maybe we can ponder is, where are we being invited to cooperate with evolution and bridge two separate worlds together? In my own life, I have felt randomly called, excited to be a part of bridging the Center for Action and Contemplation with some new work in the political sphere. And I guarantee you that we're all kind of standing on the precipice of two worlds like that, from our own practices to maybe, I had somebody come up to me while we were standing outside and she said, I've been really feeling this urge to work with young women and mothers. Can I just say yes, amen, please do? So where are we being called to be bridge builders and participating together, as you said so beautifully, Ed, we need the wisdom and we need the depth. And we all kind of have a role to play in this, but it's definitely clear to me anyway, clear to hopefully all of us, that we're forming kind of a new container for something, but that it really requires us all to bring our full selves and participate.
Thank you, Bree. Yeah. So, and flow with that call to discernment, I want to invite us just to take a moment to actually drop into our hearts. You may feel questions swirling around in your head. We want the questions that are coming from your heart. So just take a moment to let your awareness settle down into your heart, receive all that's been shared, and see if there's a question arising that you want to pose to the panel, or if our elders here have something they would like to offer.
I have a question, and Bree, this is mostly for you. It also bridges to what Ed said of 4 generations. Well, 5 generations. We left out your children. So what can we do as adults, mothers, parents? My kids are grown, but I still am part of their lives. So how do we interact, foster, learn from the youth that's even more youthful than you?
That's a really important question. And one that I think we should ponder as we consider whatever we're going to be doing next, or whatever the next gathering or iteration of this looks like. I would love to see little ones here and families. And the thing is, it's very difficult for young parents to get away, just from an economic standpoint, let alone a time standpoint. You've got work, priorities, and then you're exhausted parents. Are you really going to spend that precious money that you've been saving for a vacation to come to a weekend for teaching? So I think we need to consider the price points of our gatherings and where they're located, as well as how we're thinking about inclusivity at the level of making sure that children and young parents are welcome. I can guarantee you that a young mom would be very happy to hand off her baby. And I can guarantee you that many of you would be so happy to do an entire meditation sit holding a baby, right? So to the practical point of how we can support our children, I'm very inspired by Teilhard on so many levels. Is it Jean Houston? I screwed this up the other time. Is it Jean Houston who has that story of Teilhard at the park?
It is.
That's right. Jean Houston tells the story of interacting with Teilhard when she was a child. And the only principle that he used was curiosity. The whole time they were walking through, the New York City Central Park, he would just walk with awe and wonder. Oh, look at this. What is this? Oh, isn't this wonderful? Oh, look at this tree. Look at this. And he encouraged her curiosity and awe and wonder. And I think that's a very good place to start for us as parents. Curiosity, awe, and wonder. And if we can live those values and encourage those values in our children, then all of the rest of this stuff will grow up from that fertile soil. The capacity to be curious about other traditions, the capacity to be curious about people who are different from us, and to have conversations across difference. And I really see that as a central need. If we can cultivate that ground of awe and wonder, if we can protect and name the sacred in our children, and name and help point out and discover with them the sacredness of our planet, then they will grow up to be people who recognize the sacred in everyone else, I hope.
Yeah, just a quick comment. Another thing that Teilhard said is that ours is a psychic evolution, and that we were moving toward a global collective consciousness. And the reason I mention it, when you go into this group work and network of network group, it becomes very apparent that there are people with this ability to lean in, catch a group consciousness, catch a group creativity, and amazing things happen. And there are others that are not in that consciousness. They're more about their program, what they want to see. And we see this all the time. And so we are really in that place of our developmental level going to how we really understand what it means to work in group consciousness.
We have a question back here, I see. We've got a mic back here, and then Pat will jump back forward.
I hope I can express this question so that it's understandable. Is the mic on?
It is. Just hold it close.
About 2.5 years ago, we had an election, and it brought many, many people into a deep state of anguish and concern. And soon after that, Ken Wilber published an article, and it later became a book. And in that article, I haven't read his book, but in the article there were several things, one of which he referred to the election as an evolutionary correction. Another point that he made in his book, and I admire him for this, because instead of wringing his hands and moving into a deep state of anguish, he did some internal, I'm expecting he did some internal evaluation, and his conclusion was that this, and there's many other things in the book, I'm just drawing things that support my question. He asserts that the leading edge of consciousness got off track, and so the correction was necessary. And the primary issue that he raised in the leading edge of consciousness was this, and it probably came about through understanding and compassion and loving everyone and all of these things that we espouse. But part of that resulted in your truth is your truth, and your truth is your truth, and your truth is your truth, your truth. And there was no deep truth. There was no real truth, because everyone in their effort for understanding everyone else didn't have that depth to provide the guidance that's necessary. So here's my question. Is there something here that we need to keep in mind? Is there a lesson that we need to keep in mind from what Ken Wilber expressed as being a concern as we work on what we're working on here? Or are all of you who are leading this, are you beyond the leading edge of consciousness to a level beyond that? That's my question.
So we'll open that to others here in the front too, if anyone wants to respond to that. But maybe before we respond, let's just take a breath to receive a pretty heavy question. And then anyone who wants to respond. No one wants to respond.
I'll share something that was brought to my attention recently by a writer, Larry Diamond, who's written a book, Ill Winds, that calls us to not be complacent in our democratic country. And I am so grateful for the spiritual freedom that I've known my entire life. And I think that context for this interspirituality is democracy. And so how we remember what it is to be we the people, and how we uphold democracy not only in our country but in other countries. And we all know we're not taught civics anymore. So just like this question of interspirituality education, how many of us really know what it means to be a citizen in a democracy, and how the two can inform each other?
Thank you. And any response from panelists?
Yeah, and I know, Rory, you have a lot to say about the democracy piece. Also, where's the gentleman who brought up the post-truth? Can you just say your name for me? Dave. Thank you for bringing that up, because I do think that that's really pertinent to why we're here and something that we feel is percolating in our midst. I think at an evolutionary level, we have been set adrift by this postmodern idea that everybody has their own truth. Everything is relative. And so there is a general malaise because of that. There's nothing that's creating a coherent worldview anymore. And one of the things that I think is exciting is this gathering. Now, what would it look like for us to come together in a significant gathering, once a year or once every couple years? A gathering where the wisdom of all the different traditions can be brought forward as here is a coherent truth. Here's a coherent whole. There is a one truth underneath all of this diversity. We can return to kind of a cohesive view of things again. And so I think that what you offered us is an invitation for us to ponder that whatever we're up to, What would it look like if we could kind of convene and bring political leaders and influencers to that table so that then that message gets spread in our culture at wide?
I'm going to just try and be quick, 'cause I know there's a few more questions. So I'm doing a lot of thinking on democracy right now. And I do think that interspirituality is in many ways a religious framework that grows out of democracy and democratic ideals and us coming together. I've actually started to think of democracy as its own religious tradition, with its own values and its own, and what I mean by religious tradition is undergirded by ultimacy. In other words, that which is supporting it. And it has its own flowerings and its own attributes that have to be cultivated and have to be embraced and named and then unnamed. But so starting to think about it like that, so we hold it as something sacred, and we can hold politics as something sacred and difficult. Maybe the most, I think it was Plato said, it's the most difficult art form of the human race. We're trying to figure out how to live together. That we even have this country and can do it is a testament to divine reality. I mean, look at we have such different ideas of how we should be governed, how we should live. Our country is huge. It's a very difficult process. So just to name that so that we can hold it that way. And we don't slide into thinking everything should just be the way we want it to be or the way we think it should be. And then real quick to your question, I think part of, for me, what happened with Trump, it is an evolutionary correction, not only for this postmodern thing, but it's asking us to really deal with deep issues as a country moving forward in terms of gender and race in particular. And we have real issues with that. And we are increasingly becoming a multicultural, diverse, we'll be minority white in 20 years. So there's a reaction against that. But there's also an intense need for healing and finding new ways forward. And so I would really encourage everyone. I mean, I've also spent the last 3 years in a pretty extreme social justice university. And it was in many ways, these are people I share heart space with, I share solidarity with, I want the same goals. And it was a toxic atmosphere. So to me, there's something about the embodied reality. We have to find the new way forward, and it's not out there yet. Like one of the things we do with our dialogues that's very different than the Snowmass Conference is we work very hard to have at least half women. And you start with a list of 30 men because that's how it's been traditionally, and this person would be so great on this topic. And it has to really be a commitment to do it in a way that's not tokenism. I'm not having this person just because they're a woman. You have to really work and find people that are going to resonate, it's the right topic, and then bring it together. And in my experience, I can tell you, and thank you to my partner, Natano, who really held the line on this, it changes things. To have at least half women or more, it changes the nature of the dialogue in an embodied way that cannot be reproduced in any other way. And energetically, it begins to call in openings and healings to create something else. And we also do it with racial and cultural diversity. And we're not always successful, but it's really a commitment. And we don't know what's happening. We're holding that space, and stuff comes in, and sometimes it's really intense. But I think that's the way forward. So, and on an individual level, learn about our history of racism and slavery in this country and the socioeconomic effects that are its ongoing legacy, so we're at least educated on it. And then just let that sit, figure out your own way of working with it. What are you going to do with it? And don't let that turn into towing a party line. Don't let it turn into another kind of fundamentalism or a repetition of talking points. Really let it simmer and try to figure out what your own spirit and work can do to heal it, because I think that's really what our country needs. moving forward, and that's what's being asked of us on that level.
So we've only just started a conversation, and we could continue on for hours and days, but we've reached our time limit. Some of our panelists, what's that? Oh, Pat of all people, yes. We need the final word from Pat. Thank you.
Well, once again, my heart's cracked wide open, and every single one of you that have said things have triggered for me 35 years of TK. And there's several things I want to share. But 35 and a half years ago, Thomas decided to do a 9-week retreat for 8 men. And the only thing these men had in common was they were all broken. And this was a common core. One was a fundamentalist with married, young, couple children. One was working with street people, Pike Street Market. One was an Albuquerque priest working with AA. One was a top-notch lawyer that was part of a group of 7 that hammered a nuclear missile head, and his ass had just gotten out of jail. Blah, 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 blah. Anyway, we had a woman that lived in Snowmass that offered to pay the electricity for the 9 weeks at the ranch house. The abbot gave us the ranch house for 9 weeks. Thomas brought me up on a bus from the Lama Foundation to cook for the 3 weeks. And he gave his all. He was just there teaching, live teaching, twice a day, every single day. And at night, he came back for Q&A. And one of the questions Paul Peterhans had asked was about inner spirituality and how you get to the basic core. And Kurt, your talk about anytime you get into complexity and you hit inclusiveness, and the answer is love. Thomas's answer was just an image that was so crystal clear to me that this is 35 and a half years ago, and I've never forgotten it. He said, oh, it's like a bicycle. And he said, you can jump around the edges of the spoke, and you'll learn a little bit. But he said, if each one of the traditions takes the spoke and rides it to the center, you all end up in love. And, it was so, so, so clear. And he consistently used community as the way of going forward. So whether it was the community of monthly retreats for 10 days a month, he was bringing a community together. He created that community in 9 weeks. The communities then are going back out to the entire global planet. And how many people does each person who comes on retreat hit? So that's how we go forward. Meditation Chapel, we're in the internet. We now have, at the last count that I heard of, 1,800 meditation chapels on the internet. So these are just all ways of going forward. And like you, Bree, we have 9 kids. If you have them in your face, which you do because you love them, you have to grow. That's all there is to it.
Amen. So we do have to stop right now. I've been told by the chapel that we've reached the cutoff point. There's time for conversations.
A little
Heather,
bit.
can we do more?
No, we can't, sorry.
Heather
Yeah,
says we
we
can't.
can't.
But there's time if people want to stay and have conversations following. Panelists and folks will be hanging out, so feel free to keep the conversation going. We are the conversation, and it will continue flowing. But let's just come back to our chant, and then Heather's going to lead us out with a few words. So, as Pat reminded us, may it be love, and may our hearts open. Open my heart, open my heart, open my heart, open my heart, open my heart. Open my heart. Open my heart. Open my heart. May it be so.
I hate to stop this conversation. It's been so amazing and such an exquisite 2 days. And thank you, all of you panelists, all of you guys who've come from so far. Thank you. Thank you to the Spiritual Paths people. It's been amazing. And this is not just, this isn't the beginning, it's the continuation. And we will be in touch and we'll just see where this all goes. So thank you so much from all of us here. And we'll say goodbye. We're going to lock up in about 20 minutes. So, and I'm mindful we need to get people to the airport and all sorts of things. So it's goodbye from us. And yes, thank you. You'll find anyone who lives locally. I've put a bit of paper that looks like this. It'll be near you somewhere. If you're interested in carrying on this work locally or based at the chapel, just fill it out and put it on that table there. Not now. Thank you, that's it. Thanks.